Hey guys, today we're going to be discussing Team of Rivals by Doris, Kearns, Goodwin, a biography of Abraham Lincoln. So, first thing to go over with this book, I think, is should you read it? And to that I would say a unanimous yes. It's an excellent history book, nonfiction, but written like fiction. You really learn the backstories and the motivations and the intentions of the different characters, that they feel very real. And it's all true, so it helps form your worldview about the founding of America, America going through a really interesting turning point, and I think its themes on leadership are relevant outside of the historical context. So the first thing I think to go over is, so Team of Rivals, why is it called that? Well, the book, or the historian, Goodwin, uses sources from four men's, letters that were three of which were contemporaries of Lincoln, one of which was Lincoln. And those four men are the Team of Rivals. Well, why are they rivals? Because they were all competing for the 1860 Republican nomination, when America was going through this turbulent time of what do we do about slavery, the South and the North. This issue is getting worse and worse as the country expands west, and states are being forced to decide, are they going to be a slave state or not, which will tilt the balance of power. The Republican Party is actually new, a replacement to the Whig Party, as far as I recall. It's been about 6 months since I read the book. Who are these four men? Well, the first was the frontrunner for the nomination, William Seward, a senator from upstate New York. Actually, the book opens on his country manor with cannon being rolled out because they'll presume that they'll get a telegram that evening saying he won the nomination. Of course, he did not. Salmon Chase, the governor of Ohio, a corpulent, rich man, and very arrogant, actually one of my favorite characters, always scheming against Lincoln. He always thought that he was smarter and would eventually become president. He, I think, became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court or something. Edward Bates, a judge from St. Louis, somewhat of a racist figure, but kind of like a dark horse candidate in the convention because he could kind of appeal to the South, potentially, to keep the Union together. Because remember, this election, it's not just about who can win, it's if the person wins, can they keep the country together? So it's a very interesting election. And of course, the fourth man of the Team of Rivals was Lincoln himself. Local to Illinois, would not have won the nomination nor become president if it was not in Springfield, which is near where he practiced, where he had people at that convention garnering votes for him. So the book opens with that scene of these four men waiting for their telegram if they won. And then it takes a step back and goes through their background, their history, so you get to know them. It resumes the action, or I guess it goes further back for Lincoln, and then it resumes the action from 1860. Of course, Abraham Lincoln wins that nomination and later wins the presidency, barely keeping the nation together. He's sworn in, and then, of course, has arguably the best 5 years of a president that an American president has ever had. He keeps the country together for a while. He wins the war that had to be fought, and leaves his mark on history in many ways. So there is a movie by the same title, actually, or not the same title, but it's title of Lincoln, that's on the top here. It's released in 2012 by Spielberg with a good performance by Daniel Day-Lewis, but really much more simplistic than the book. One of the interesting things I found was from the beginning, when he won the nomination, when he won the presidency even, people doubted Lincoln's ability. Because there was such, violent hatred between the South and the North after his election, when he had said, not directly saying that he was pro-abolition, but saying that he would prefer to not have slavery, or kind of these, half statements. Of course, so the election takes place in November, but the president isn't inaugurated until January, so there's a 3-month period there where it was touch and go, and he had to be snuck into Washington, D.C. In the meantime, a corrupt Democratic president makes this speech saying that, well, we should really wait till what the Supreme Court says about the Negro question. Of course, he doesn't reveal that he knows what the Supreme Court is going to rule on what becomes known as the Dred Scott case, a blemish on American history for sure, where it says Negroes don't have any rights. But he kind of pretends that he doesn't know, and he says we should let the justice system provide this answer. So that's the situation that Lincoln inherits. People are doubting his ability, and the country could not be in worse straits. A lot of disunity, not a lot of competent characters even in the government. Seward, the man that was the favorite but did not win the nomination or the presidency, even thinks that, oh, I'll be nominated to Lincoln's cabinet, and then I'll be the real president. I'll make the real decisions. He kind of thought Lincoln was a fool, which within a few months he realized he was not. He was working with a very shrewd operator. So I think I'll just go through maybe 4 issues that Lincoln's unique leadership was shown off, that I think are interesting historical stories that I got from the book, and also relevant today. So the first one is, well, again, why is it called Team of Rivals? Well, these 3 men that Lincoln was competing with the nomination for, he actually brought into his cabinet. The book calls it his official family. So he brings them in and leverages each of their unique characteristics. So for Seward, he brings him in as Secretary of State. Seward was a senator, which has more experience. The Senate deals with more foreign policy issues. Salmon Chase, a rich man, not necessarily a very charismatic man, but a good administrator, an honest bureaucrat, he made Secretary of the Treasury. And he played a critical role in raising funds for the Union abroad that some argue helped them win the war, because the South, the notes were always considered to not be official government coin or government debt, so they couldn't raise the money to then build the armies. And then finally, Bates, which is one of the minor characters actually in the book, becomes the Attorney General. So I think that is a very unique aspect of his leadership style. Well, generally, I guess at the time, incoming presidents just picked their friends, gave them patronage positions, people, yes men, and I think the book adequately reflects that. Actually, one of the times after Lincoln had passed away, tragically in the assassination, Seward has this really nice thing to say about him. So this is at Lincoln's funeral. All of Washington was present, Gideon Welles sadly noted. Congressmen, senators, justices, diplomats, governors, military officers, the members of the cabinet, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. Quote, but Abraham Lincoln was not there. All felt this, end quote. None felt that absent more keenly than the members of his cabinet, the remarkable group of rivals whom Lincoln had brought into his official family. They had fiercely opposed one another and often contested their chief on important questions, but as Seward later remarked, quote, a cabinet which should agree at once on every such question would be no better or safer than one counselor, end quote. By calling these men to his side, Lincoln had afforded them an opportunity to exercise their talents to the fullest and to share in the labor and the glory of the struggle that would reunite and transform their country and secure their own places in posterity. So a really nice use of what is leadership? Well, leadership is bringing together people with disparate abilities, but also maybe disparate personalities and motivations, and building them into a cohesive team. And you just feel that reading this book, how much Lincoln was able to submit his own desires to the greater good, and to know kind of what drove each man and how what was a good role for them. His Secretary of War, whose name I don't remember, was also critical. The second example that the book goes through showing Lincoln's unique leadership ability was how he managed his generals. So unlike the South, which had Robert E. Lee from beginning to end, the North had something like 4 generals take the lead command. And even though that's kind of how I learned it in my American history class, it's clear that even though there was always one supreme commander, the generals were always very jealous of each other, vying for glory. Then, even though the Union was better equipped, had more men, had more money, probably had the better strategic position, the first few years of the war was very difficult for the Union, in part because of all this infighting. And one of the best examples was General McClellan, who was again a very arrogant man, and kind of a perfectionist in the sense that he never wanted to fight if he had any chance of losing. And so he gave General Lee a lot of time to build up the South, to recruit men, to kind of do this militia stuff, because he didn't want to march, even though his army had been gathered on the Potomac. So I'll just read one more interesting passage about that. There's another man mentioned in this, McDowell, who is another one of the generals at the time, in theory inferior to McClellan, subordinate. McClellan's catalog of gripes and concerns was endless. There was bridges to be built, bad roads, regiments to be organized. When Lincoln eventually ordered McDowell to reinforce him, the general continued to protest, this is McClellan, that, quote, "If I cannot fully control all of his, McDowell's, troops, I want none of them, but would prefer to fight the battle with what I have and let others be responsible for the results." Quote. Finally, he confided in his wife, again, this is McClellan, quote, "Utmost prudence was essential. I must not unnecessarily risk my life, for the fate of my army depends upon me, and they all know it." So here was a man who was again, very arrogant. He would eventually run for president against Lincoln in 64, I believe. And they would not take Lincoln's orders. So Lincoln had to deftly maneuver this, had to fire a lot of them. Eventually he found Ulysses S. Grant, an alcoholic, but, kind of ironically, the most efficient operator of them all, who would win the war for the North. The third and the biggest issue, of course, that the book tackles is Lincoln's position and handling of slavery, the slavery question. So for this one, the book states that Lincoln was not an abolitionist by any means, but it's clear that in his heart he was against slavery. But at the time he had to hold his tongue quite a lot. When Lincoln was first elected to the House of Representatives to represent Illinois, or a part of Illinois, he violently opposed James Polk's Mexican-American War. And he took a big political hit because of that. Manifest Destiny was good for everyone in America. It was an opportunity to expand, to get more land, to get more resources. And even though the reasons for the Mexican-American War were kind of obviously, to a neutral observer, contrived, there was enough behind a good thing of expansion that it was politically difficult to refuse it or to go against it. He did go against it. It cost him hugely. And I think he learned a lesson there, where in the future he wanted to hold his tongue. He only would take action until he really had, a critical decision. So when he was trying to get the nomination in 1860 for the Republican ticket, and when he was trying to win the presidency, he was, always trying to appeal to both the Southerners and the Northern neutrals and the Northern abolitionists. So he would say things like, well, slavery is protected in the Constitution, which is correct. People don't realize this maybe now. We don't want to think about it. But, slaves were given 3/5 of a vote equivalent, although they couldn't vote themselves, of course. So, he would, and the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution says that states must help each other to return fugitive slaves. So he would say that, but then at the same time he would say, it's the peculiar institution. It's not something we should move towards. We should keep it to the states where it's in and not let it expand, which of course the Southerners didn't like because they knew eventually that would lead to the balance of power shifting towards free states. But I think, of course, the best example of Lincoln dealing with the slavery issue head-on was the Emancipation Proclamation, which, when simplistic historian or history will say Lincoln freed the slaves, that's how he did it, although it's simplistic to say he freed the slaves in that statement. But it's an interesting example of Lincoln's leadership and, of course, a critical decision that he made. So the Emancipation Proclamation was not legislation. It was actually an executive wartime order that Lincoln, as the commander-in-chief, had the ability to execute and to give out. And I'll just briefly read a scene where the cabinet, Lincoln's team of rivals is discussing emancipation and should they emancipate the slaves in land that they had claimed from the South. The desultory talk abruptly ended when Lincoln took the floor and announced he had called them together in order to read the preliminary draft of an Emancipation Proclamation. He understood the, quote, differences in the cabinet on the slavery question, end quote, and welcomed their suggestions after they heard what he had to say, but he wanted them to know that he had, quote, had resolved upon this step and had not called them together to ask their advice, quote, end quote. Then, removing 2 full scalp sheets from his pocket and adjusting his glasses on his nose, he began to read what amounted to a legal brief for emancipation based on the chief executive's powers as commander-in-chief. His draft proclamation set January 1st, 1863, little more than 5 months away, as the date on which all slaves within states still in rebellion against the Union would be declared free, thenceforward and forever, quote. It required no cumbersome enforcement proceedings, though it did not cover the roughly 425,000 slaves in the loyal border states, where, without the use of his war powers, no constitutional authority justified his action. The proclamation was shocking in scope. In a single stroke, it superseded legislation on slavery and property rights that had guided policy in 11 states for nearly 3/4 of a century. 3.5 million blacks who had lived enslaved for generations were promised freedom. It was a daring move, Wells later said, quote, fraught with consequences immediate and remote, such as human foresight could not penetrate, end quote. Another interesting thing that the book documents is how Lincoln wanted to be very clear on the messaging about the Emancipation Proclamation. So he announced it to his cabinet 5 months before it was to take effect, but he then waited for a wartime victory of the North to declare it because he didn't want it to be seen as desperate. He didn't want it to be seen as the North, opportunistically taking the slaves of the South to enlist them in the war effort. He wanted it to be seen as, kind of triumphant and moral and from the heart, and to be a moral leader. So he waited for a victory, I believe, in Georgia or something, to announce it, and then it would take effect. And I think it's also kind of interesting and clever how it was limited to the states in rebellion, so it wouldn't affect the loyal border states. So again, here's Lincoln keeping together, his patchwork of his government, of his larger team. So with that, I'll go over what the book says about Lincoln's legacy. And this is the part at the end where, of course, to finish the story, Lincoln wins re-election, not unanimously, but resoundingly in 1864. He, of course, wins the war, and then he's very shortly, I think 3 weeks after victory, assassinated by a Virginian. So he, it's so tragic. He had so little time to enjoy the fruits of all his labors. He lost his son, not during the war as a combatant, but due to illness, and got very little sleep during that entire period. So it's quite sad. At the end, I found myself, really, almost in tears, kind of thinking about what that man gave to the country. At the same time, his tragic assassination guaranteed that his legacy, that his story would live on forever. So the book closes with the famous Russian author Leo Tolstoy traveling, through the reaches of North Caucasus. Tolstoy, the greatest writer of the age, was a guest of a tribal chief, living far away from civilized life in the mountains. Quote, gathering his family and his neighbors, the chief asked Tolstoy to tell stories about the famous men of history. Tolstoy told how he entertained the eager crowd for hours with tales of Alexander, Caesar, Frederick the Great, and Napoleon. But when he was winding to a close, the chief stood and said, quote, but you have not told us a syllable about the greatest general and the greatest ruler of the world. We want to know something about him. He was a hero. He spoke with a voice of thunder. He laughed like the sunrise, and his deeds were strong as the rock. His name was Lincoln, and the country in which he lived is called America, which is so far away that if a youth should journey to reach it, he would be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. I looked at them, Tolstoy recalled, and saw their faces all aglow, while their eyes were burning. I saw that those rude barbarians were really interested in a man whose name and deeds had already become a legend. End quote. He told them everything he knew about Lincoln's, quote, home life and youth, his habits, his influence upon the people, and his physical strength, end quote. When he finished, they were so grateful for the story that they presented him with, quote, a wonderful Arabian horse, end quote. The next morning, as Tolstoy prepared to leave, they asked if he could possibly acquire for them a picture of Lincoln. It continues. Tolstoy went on to observe, quote, this little incident proves how largely the name of Lincoln is worshipped throughout the world and how legendary his personality has become. Now, why was Lincoln so great that he overshadows all other national heroes? He really was not a great general like Napoleon or Washington. He was not such a skillful statesman as Gladstone or Frederick the Great. But his supremacy expresses itself altogether in his peculiar moral power and in the greatness of his character. Washington was a typical American. Napoleon was a typical Frenchman. But Lincoln was a humanitarian as broad as the world. He was bigger than his country, bigger than all the presidents together. We are still too near his greatness, Tolstoy concluded, but after a few centuries more, our posterity will find him considerably bigger than we do. His genius is still too strong and too powerful for the common understanding, just as the sun is too hot when its light beams directly on us. So with that, I will close this review and discussion of Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Highly recommend you check it out. Feel free to hit me up with your feedbacks or comments or suggestions. Thanks, and see you soon. Can you see both of us?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Hi, we're here with Q&A. That didn't make sense. Hi. Hi, welcome to the Q&A portion of Nick Huber's video blog book reviews. So, I'm here with Mochi, and we've listened to everything Nick had to say, and I have some questions for my husband. So my first question is, you mentioned that you had a favorite character because you thought he was really funny. Is there something specific he said or did in the book that
I forgot to bring that up, actually. Yeah, so that was Salmon Chase. I never explained that. He was very arrogant, like McClellan, which is why I liked him. He was like a big fat guy from Ohio. His wife passed away tragically early, and I think he married someone else, and his wives kept dying, but he had a beautiful daughter who kind of became his like hostess and his like de facto, party wife. But the funny thing about him is no one liked him, but he had such a high opinion of himself that he always thought he would be president. So in his letters, he always his first cabinet meeting, he's writing all this hate to other people, being like, Lincoln, this guy is so dumb. I could do, he'd subtly say like, I could be doing a better job. So I think he's hilarious because I think everyone in our lives knows someone whose opinion of themselves is way higher than their actual ability, and he's just that guy. And he was just super rich, or not super rich, but he was wealthy and like just this aristocrat, and so like they gave him Secretary of the Treasury, but like it's clear that he didn't have much popular appeal or really political deftness. So I just found him funny how Lincoln managed him, and I just found him very, very relatable.
Okay, so who among the characters, aside from Lincoln, were you able to truly relate to? Or was it just him?
I think it's hard to say. Probably none of them, because all these guys are like at the peak of their powers, right? They're like 50 something, and they're not dealing with like the mundane realities that I deal with. So just like personality-wise, I think actually Salmon Chase, because I used to be a bit of a grump myself, who thought higher than other people, thought higher of myself than other people did, and kind of bad talked people. Or in his personality, Lincoln was not relatable because he was so exemplary, but he was
Right.
he was a model. He was an exemplar, but like he would just really well navigate other people's foibles and motivations, which is something that like I can relate to, but I can't do myself, but I aspire to do. So I think, yeah.
Okay, so the last question, because we're obsessed with beauty contests, and this is a question I would ask someone competing in a beauty contest, is what is your Lincoln moment?
My hashtag Lincoln moment.
Yes.
When I built a team at my work. It was the first time I was a manager, and I recruited my team. And now we have 5 people under me. And I think being a manager, you just start to see how different people are good at different things. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses, but actually what I would prefer to have is a team that has very divergent strengths and weaknesses, because then you can combine them into a cohesive, sum is greater than the what's the phrase?
Sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum
The
of its
whole
parts.
is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yes.
So I think that is very true. And
Very Lincoln.
Very Lincoln.
And that's it.
out.
Bye. Mikey. It's like, I was just a prop. But you were so good when Daddy was talking.